Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on spreadsheet-based GRC, the costs, risks, and complexity associated with spreadsheet-based GRC. Introducing myself, I'm Don Latham, Vice President of Product Marketing for Links Technology Partners. I've been in the security and compliance space for 12 years, working with customers and partners, understanding the needs and requirements of the space and understanding how vendors are able to provide services and products that meet customer needs. Joining me today is Anna Dickerson. Anna, can you give us a quick introduction?
Sure. Again, I'm Anna Dickerson. I'm the VP of IT Security Operations and Risk Management Services for Links, and I am also a cybersecurity SME who has concentrated in cybersecurity assessments and information assurance for about 13 years across multiple verticals, including federal government, healthcare, energy sector, and higher education.
Excellent. And we're very excited to have all that experience and expertise to help us drill down into this particular topic. In looking at spreadsheet-based GRC, as I've researched the market on this and talked with customers specifically about this topic, one of the things that's become very, very clear is the idea that spreadsheets start out as a great tool for tackling small, quick GRC projects that organizations see pop up, or the first time that they're tasked with doing GRC. It makes sense for them to go to their go-to tool. The spreadsheet being universally used in business, almost everyone's familiar with how to use it. Tie that in with email for doing the communication and collaboration, and file servers for storing files. And it seems to be that you can cobble together a GRC solution by defining a process and using these daily tools like spreadsheets and email. But as I talked with customers and looked at the market, it became very clear that as we move beyond just very basic GRC processes, that the complexity increases, and with that complexity is an exponential rise in cost and risk associated with using spreadsheets in a GRC environment. So today we'd like to look at some of these areas around cost, risk, and complexity, and get some of Anna's real-world learnings about how to handle these or the challenges that pop up when using spreadsheets in GRC. First, looking at complexity, it's, as I mentioned, usually GRC projects start out as small, confined, very straightforward, and being able to handle that with a spreadsheet makes all the sense in the world. But as more projects are come together, as more GRC efforts are centralized, and it's important to get economies of scale and have a consistent approach throughout the organization, processes and workflow become much more complex in a big hurry. And with that, the level of coordination and communication that has to happen, email threads get out of control in trying to coordinate GRC processes. And that in turn impacts scalability and the ability for an organization to apply GRC to a broader scope and coverage of the organization's needs in terms of managing governance and risk and compliance. And where spreadsheets in the beginning were a great way to increase the company's agility in being very agile and addressing GRC requirements, in the end, as this complexity factor increases, the agility actually goes away, and spreadsheets cause organizations to actually become more rigid in what they can do in the area of GRC. So it's an interesting impact of complexity as people try to increase their GRC capabilities. Anna, does this line up with what you've seen in your career and your experience?
Yes, absolutely. So as as regulatory requirements change, complexity is a problem. As the organization grows, complexity becomes a problem. So an organization might have to adhere to multiple requirements again across different frameworks. And what should happen is that you should be able to say, we answered yes here for this control in this regulation. So we are also meeting the control here in this other regulation. But what usually happens with spreadsheets is that you'll have different people working on different spreadsheets, and then maybe they collaborate, maybe they don't. I worked for an organization where there were quite a few different authoritative regulatory requirements, including FSMA, HIPAA, SSA 16, and SOC 2, and different SMEs managing those different spreadsheets. So we were trying to come together, to make sure, at least on a weekly basis, that we were all, answering those common controls the same way. So we're talking about collaboration here, but not just with the SMEs, but, when you think about your technical POCs or your control owners, collaboration becomes, even more cumbersome, because the SMEs, you have to take the time to walk them through the spreadsheet, and you need these people. You absolutely need them to answer these control questions. It takes a very long time, because of scheduling issues, and then many times you're asking basically the same controls differently each time you do an assessment. So one SME may ask the networking administrator how they're meeting a control for FSMA, and then another SME may come along, a few weeks later or a month or so later for a SOC 2 assessment and ask the same question. So it gets really quite time consuming for everyone involved. When you have these controls mapped in a GRC tool, you're asking that control owner one question that many times will cover, all of the organizational requirements for that control type. So not only that, but many GRC tools allow the administrator the ability to put in some supplemental information in the control verbiage to help the control owner or administrator to understand the control a little better, rather than sitting down with them for hours and hours explaining the controls out and why they're important and why they have to adhere to them. So in my experience, the control owners become very overwhelmed, and they feel they spend too much time answering these controls when they need to be working on their servers or networking devices, and making sure that their services are up for either their organization or their customers. So another layer is when we're talking about attestations and gathering evidence and artifacts. Tracking those by spreadsheets becomes very complex. So yes, it becomes very challenging when you're using a spreadsheet.
And, coming back to that first slide that I showed, that as this complexity increases, so does cost and risk. There's, in my research, I ran across just a wonderful quote from Michael Rasmussen, the GRC pundit, about what he's seen in this area. And he was working with a client and saw that 80% of their risk, compliance, control, audit, and security full-time employee resources were doing nothing more than spreadsheet reconciliation. So the cost factor there, to me, it stunned me that it could be that high, that 80% of these highly compensated professionals could be doing basic spreadsheet reconciling and reporting. The scope of that across thousands of spreadsheets, and the fact that in the end, that reconciliation effort induced errors within the actual reports and data. Just an absolutely clear example of how complexity can drive up cost and risk. In my research and talking with customers, some of the key areas that they consistently brought up was the idea that spreadsheets, although great tools at the beginning to quickly get in and get the job done, over time they become so inefficient and introduce just in every dimension different inefficiencies. That leads to productivity losses that, as Michael said in his quote, can become huge. And what's also sometimes not noticed is that the organization has GRC processes in place to hopefully benefit the organization, to make the organization more competitive, better able to service their customers and reduce the risk associated with regulatory environments. And if GRC is not functioning well, it can actually become an interference into the normal operation of an organization. And then the cost factors also impact how well people can collaborate and communicate within the GRC effort itself. Can you give us some of your experiences where you've seen cost factors come in because of spreadsheets?
Yeah, absolutely. And everything you're saying it's absolutely true. So definitely more time is taken to manage the spreadsheet than actually looking at the controls that, you're supposed to be applying in your environment. So what happens is you end up paying that cybersecurity subject matter expert to manage a spreadsheet, and inevitably you're going to be hiring more people, right? So you'll have a team of people who are working on, these spreadsheets, collaborating, trying to map them back, and it becomes very costly. And then, you have the cost of making mistakes. And, depending on your organization, when there are mistakes, there are fines, and the cost to the company can be, quite significant. I was on a project that was literally 2,600 lines of data, which I had to map back to 6 different regulatory requirements. So you can imagine that it took quite a bit of time. There was another engagement where, there was an update to a regulation, and it took a team of 8 people months to update that spreadsheet because of all of the mappings back to the authoritative controls. So it's a manual effort, and it becomes very costly.
Definitely. And another aspect, of course, is the risk that can come in. Customers told me that these error rates that we've mentioned, actually, where GRC is supposed to help manage and eliminate risk, that those errors actually increased increased the risk that they would be subject to regulatory penalties and fines. The other aspect here is from an audit standpoint, being able to have a very well documented audit trail. Definitely a challenge with spreadsheets. And because of that, oftentimes an auditor will recognize that the spreadsheets and the reports based off of those spreadsheets are not an accurate, measurement of the risk and compliance state of an organization. And when that happens, the obvious result is that auditors say, oh, I better start looking at this more closely. And so the auditor scrutiny really gets intense when they start to see some of these risk points pop up in the audit process. Does this line up with your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're going to get errors. You're going to get, in some cases, lots of errors. So spreadsheets are great, for so many things, but managing security assessments, it's just not the best use for that tool. And there is a substantial amount of risk associated with using spreadsheets as your GRC tool. They can become corrupted. They get lost. You have change control issues. Even if you have in your organization a really good change management program, you're probably still going to have change control issues, or your system crashes. Going back to making mistakes and errors, it can really cost the company in terms of risk. So that spreadsheet that I worked on, that was 2,600 lines long, it actually became corrupted when I sent it to someone to review. So I had to go back to that last good saved copy. So it was about half a day's of work that was gone. Another example is when we were using a spreadsheet and one of the SMEs didn't include one of the controls that we should have added. So basically, since it wasn't added to the spreadsheet, it was never put in front of the control owner. So it was a simple mistake of not adding that control and forwarding it to the control owner to answer resulted in a finding during that audit, just because it was never really looked at. So again, there is some risk there, and sometimes some significant risk associated with not using a proper GRC tool.
Yeah, definitely the case. And when you look at this, I think we've done a fairly good job at looking at the challenges with using spreadsheets as your main GRC tool. I'd like to shift gears now and talk just briefly about what do we do if an organization is using spreadsheets, starting to see that truly the complexity, costs, and risk factors are, impacting the business. What's the best approach to transition to a GRC solution that could help move away from some of these problems that we see with spreadsheets? From your experience, and you've got a team working for you that they've also got a lot of experience in helping customers make this transition from spreadsheets to a GRC solution. Can you walk us through what you would say are some best practices in making that transition?
Sure. Yeah. The first thing I would say is to take it slow. It's important because everyone wants those immediate results, but, taking the time to transition the organization properly, to make sure that the SMEs are comfortable, that the control owners or administrators are comfortable, your ISO, it's really important to make sure they're comfortable with that GRC tool before, you let them loose with it, and making sure that you choose the right GRC tool for your organization, making sure that it's configurable. So making sure that it's configurable for your needs, for instance, ensuring that you have the ability to move the scores from like a previous audit into the GRC tool. That's very, very important for tracking purposes and, for reviews. So I guess the last thing would probably be making sure that you have the support you need to make it successful, whether it's, internal support or external, from the vendor. And I think lastly, the GRC tool should have a nice workflow process so that it enhances your overall visibility into your security posture.
Excellent. I think that's very, very sound process and advice there. So thank you so much for taking your time today, Anna, to run us through your experiences and your guidance on addressing the challenges of using spreadsheets as your main GRC tool. I'd like to thank the audience for taking time out of their busy schedules to to start to understand some of the complexities, costs, and risks that may be associated in your organization around using spreadsheets. If you believe that you've reached a point to where you want to look at transitioning away from spreadsheets to a GRC tool, encourage you to reach out to Links and we can set you up and with Anna and some of her team to discuss how we may be able to help you. Also, we have quite a few resources at linksgrc.com that would help out in understanding this process. There's a self-assessment and a white paper that's available on this topic that you may be interested in also. So again, thank you for your time. Take care.